that you wanted to be like when you grow up. You wanted to be like that person so much you started to talk like them, walk like them, and move like them, and act like them. Or at least you thought. Is there somebody like that in your life that you wanted to emulate? Is the question. I don't mean mock. I remember the time my mother scolded me, and I kind of mocked her facial expressions and her words. I imitated her in all the wrong ways, friends. And I'm surprised I don't have a scar to show you for that insubordination and that insolence. I'm not talking about mocking, I'm talking about emulating. Acting in a way in which you want to replicate the best and the brightest of someone that inspired you in your life. The first person I can remember wanting to emulate was a baseball player. Some of you might remember him. His name was Willie McCovey. A long, long time ago, he played for the Giants. Willie McCovey was very tall, over 6 feet tall. He was a left-handed batter, and that didn't stop me, even though I was right-handed. I wanted to be able to stand at home plate and swing the bat just like he did. He had this real long kind of uppercut swing that oftentimes allowed him to strike the ball just the right way to take it over the right field fence. Now, that may not sound like much to you, but to me, he was my hero for a while. I wanted to emulate him. You may have someone from your childhood who was a figure, a sports figure, or someone from the arts, or someone from the sciences, or someone just from your neighborhood or in your family that you wanted to be like. Another person I wanted to emulate was my Aunt Ruth. My Aunt Ruth just seemed to be a person who exuded joy. Whenever you visited her or whenever she visited us, there was always a good time. And it wasn't because she brought us candy or gifts, it was because she truly enjoyed being in our company. And she took us places to visit, like the Philadelphia Zoo 95 times. And every time seemed like the first time. I wanted and still want to emulate her sense of community building, her sense of joy, her sense of love of all God's people, and especially God's children. Who is it in your life you've wanted to imitate, rather emulate? Well, today's passage of Scripture from the Philippians, Paul writes to a Christian community in a small little place called Philippi. And what he's doing with his message is encouraging the Christians there to emulate Christ, to imitate Christ. Paul is imprisoned. In spite of his being incarcerated and being limited by the confinement of his sentence, Paul does not allow that physical confinement to limit his spirit. He finds a way to send a message of hope and encouragement to those he loves. The Christians in Philippi were Christians that Paul loved. Their community was such that there was very little controversy. There was a sense of unity. There was always a room for growth, but there was a sense of single-mindedness, that they truly got the message that we were in the business as Christians of imitating the love of Christ. Not denying the sacrifice that comes with that, but also not diminishing the joy that comes with that as well. Paul was truly thankful for the Christians in Philippi. Not only for the gift that they sent, but for the lives that they were leading. Even in prison, Paul found a way to extend encouragement to those he knew were living lives of faith. We as Christians today, and as people today, often find ourselves constrained by our in a social setting. Oftentimes, we're controlled by the world around us. We are imprisoned and fail to show the rest of the world what it means to be a follower of Christ. Paul, even in the midst of being in prison, knew even more importantly that prison is not so much the walls around you, but it's the attitudes that you surround yourself with. It's the powers that you allow to control your life. Paul knew that in the midst of principalities that oppressed, that he had to fight through that oppression so that the encouragement and the love and the justice and the peace of Christ might reign even in spite of the reign of terror, or in spite of the reign of those around him who sought only their own comfort and not the goodwill of the people. Paul sees in the Philippians and in the Christians in Philippi, he sees a people who understand the freedom that comes from loving Christ, even in the midst of fighting against barriers and against those who would suppress and oppress the good news. In this, Paul calls us, and like he called the Christians in Philippi, to orient ourselves not to the world, but to orient ourselves to the will of God. The goal for Paul in this passage of Scripture and in his life was to follow his calling, a calling that came to him by God. He did not necessarily have a goal to be successful, to be the most prolific Christian theologian ever to walk the face of the earth. His goal was to acknowledge that God had called him into God's service, and to allow God to lead him wherever God willed. Even the Old Testament scripture talks about Abram, how Abram listened to God and allowed God to move him in any way in which God felt necessary. So often we have our lives so well ordered, we order God right out of our lives. To some extent, we have to reimagine what it's like to allow God to lead. Paul requires of us and of all Christians that we have an imagination, that we can even see ourselves being called by God. So many of us don't see ourselves worthy of the love even of our fellow man or woman, let alone worthy of the love of God. You are worthy. God has called you. God has a purpose for you in his life. Recently I read in the book, The Prophetic Imagination, these words. We are indeed made in the image of some God, and perhaps we have no more important theological investigation than to discern in whose image we have been made. In whose image are you made? In what God's image do you have your being? What does God look like for you? Have you considered recently in your life what your goal in life might be? Have you considered that your goal in life might not be a comfortable retirement? It might not be living in a nice